Thank you so much for having me here today. I just wanted to briefly link this paper to the theme of the presentations we have today. So I'm studying a structural transformation episode, which took place 30 years ago, and it has been studied extensively by economists before me. However, using very aggregated data. So what I bring to the table here is, and which relates very much to the theme of the presentations today, is measurement and data construction and revisiting an old question with better data than before. So to jump right in, the paper studies the GDP pattern of post-communist countries in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism in 1989. At the end of the 1980s, these communist countries implemented a variety of market reforms. When these market reforms were implemented, the expectation was that they are going to decrease inefficiencies imposed by communist economic policy and therefore increase GDP and living standards. And so against the backdrop of these expectations, this is what happened. So the average country in Eastern Europe lost almost 1/3 of its GDP in the span of a couple of years. And you can see that it took a very long time for these countries to recover to the 1980s trend, in particular 16 years. So this took here 16 years. In this paper, I'm using Hungarian microdata. So I plot here for you the Hungarian experience, losing 20% of its GDP, and similarly takes 16 years to recover to trend. So as I mentioned before, the research question is what explains this surprising GDP pattern, and other people have studied this question. The previous literature was largely theoretical though, and using limited data. To my reading, the consensus in the literature is that supply chain disruptions were responsible for the decline in GDP, and the mechanisms that are proposed are consistent with firms' productivity falling in response to these supply chain disruptions and firms' investments falling. So what I do is I bring in novel microdata at the firm level to be able to see in more detail what happened. So I assemble a data set which covers the majority of the firms in the majority of sectors between 1986 and 1999. Since my goal is to understand what factors drive the fall and the recovery, I'm going to write down a new decomposition. This is a statistical decomposition to answer this question. The two main findings is that the majority, over 90% of the fall in GDP is accounted for by a declining contribution of labor over time. And this is also a contribution that never recovers. And the second main result is that the majority of the recovery is instead accounted for by increases in aggregate productivity, in particular in improvements in the resource allocation efficiency, both of labor and of capital. And finally, the last part, I provide mechanisms through which the change in these two major channels operated. So the results I find are consistent with the large fall in labor being partly the result of inefficient employment decisions of firms during the pre-period. And for the recovery, I show evidence which is consistent with the banking privatization, helping the allocation of capital to improve over time. I might not have time for this last point, but I wanted to give you a brief overview of what the results are. Let me give you a little bit of a background on the institutional environment. So in the 1980s in Hungary, the state controls the economy. There are two types of enterprises, broadly state-owned enterprises and cooperatives. Firms' managers are largely free to make production decisions, so how much and what to produce, but their decisions are constrained by at least two important rules imposed by the state. One of these rules is that there had to be full employment. This was a rule across the whole Eastern Bloc. What this meant is everybody had the right, but also the obligation to work. And the second major constraint was that access to capital, especially to capital from Western countries, was relatively limited due to the availability of foreign currency to purchase these. And finally, there was relatively little firm dynamics in these years. So relative to a country which is similarly developed in terms of GDP per capita, there's little entry or exit of firms. Now, entry or exit of firms was also largely decided by the state. So at the end of the 1980s, these reforms were implemented. Finally, privately owned firms were allowed to grow, to be founded and to grow to any size they wished. The two large constraints I previously talked about went away, and entry and exit was now the result of private decisions as opposed to state decisions. The 1990s, you can think of Hungary as a market economy, except the fact that the banking sector was for a large part of it state-owned. The backbone of the data that I'm using is this financial statements data set for the universe of firms that have at least 20 employees in a given year between 86 and 99. I'm happy to talk about it more, but for the sake of time, I will just carry on. So for an important part of my analysis, I need to have a panel data set. However, due to institutional reasons, the longitudinal links break. So the IDs change of the same firm between the pre and the post period. So I go and look extensively at printed sources to recover these links. I also create a new database of banking locations and banking privatization events. And finally, since this structural transformation in an economic sense is also accompanied by a political change, the story that emerges from this paper also has implications on people's voting pattern. So I also use voting records and national elections at the municipal level, which I scrape. I think this picture, which depicts the value added over time, gives a good idea of the dynamics of GDP in this country. The blue, these largest area, shows the total value added of firms which existed in the pre-period. You can see that their economic importance declines over time. You can also see that the recovery is really driven by these new firms. And finally, you can see that those firms which did not survive until or into the market economy had a relatively large share in the pre-period's total value added. So let me jump to the decomposition and explain what I do exactly. So the goal of this decomposition is really to understand what factors account for the sharp fall and the slow recovery of output. What I'm decomposing, the object that I'm decomposing, is the value added of an industry between 2 years. Once I have the industry level results, I'm going to aggregate them using their relative size to get at the results at the economy level. And the basis of the decomposition is going to be firm level production functions, which is something the shape of the production function I'm going to assume, and its relevant parameters I'm going to estimate. So why go to the firm, to a decomposition which uses firm level objects in it? This firm level nature allows for the detection of more nuanced channels, accounting for a large change in GDP, including the changing heterogeneity of firms between two time periods. So what are these different factors whose role the decomposition is going to be able to identify quantitatively? So I'm going to be able to say, out of the 100% of the change in GDP between two time periods, what percent is accounted for by a change in aggregate labor, by a change in aggregate capital, by a change in allocative efficiency of labor and capital, conditional on productivity, and finally by a change in aggregate productivity. And this change in aggregate productivity can be further decomposed into the role of changing average firm level productivity and the role of changing allocative efficiency related to productivity. So this last decomposition might remind you of an Oli-Pekes style decomposition. So mean firm level productivity and allocation. That's the right way to think about it. In fact, this type of aggregate productivity decomposition is embedded into the decomposition of a larger object, which is the change in GDP between the two time periods. And finally, there are higher order terms, since this is an exact statistical decomposition, but the higher order terms are very small in the quantitative application. So in the main results of the paper, I'm using a firm, or I'm assuming a firm that has two inputs, labor and capital, and has a time varying productivity. For the sake of simplicity, let me walk you through the decomposition with an embarrassingly simple example where firm I in period T only has one input, which is labor, denoted here. Let me write down a super simple identity where the expected value added of firm I in period T can be decomposed into two components. The first one tells you what would the expected value added of this firm look like if productivity and labor were randomly allocated in this industry and time period. And the second component tells you what this expected value added, by how much this expected value added would be higher or lower, taking into account that there is sorting of productivity and inputs across firms in the industry. Now, moving to the empirical counterpart of this identity and aggregating across firms, I get the following expression. The left-hand side tells you the total value added in this industry where firm I is in time period T, and the right-hand side tells you this is the random allocation component and this is the sorting component. Now, I'm really interested in what accounts for the change in this term, so I'm going to move forward to adding a delta component here. So the change between two time periods is going to be decomposed into these two terms. Using a super simple identity, again, I'm further decomposing the red term into three further terms. And let me just explain what the interpretation of one of these terms is. So the interpretation of all the terms is a ceteris paribus interpretation. So assume that between two time periods in this industry, nothing else changes except for the fact that the average firm's productivity changes as it did in the data. The size of this term tells me how much would total value added in this industry change between these two time periods. And similarly, the third term tells you if nothing else in the industry changes except for the fact that more or less workers are working in this industry, by how much would total value added between two time periods change. All right, so in order to actually implement this decomposition, I need to estimate these four terms or much more terms in the context of the actual decomposition that I do in the paper. In order to do that, I need to estimate these red terms, the other terms I observe. So how am I going to do this? Well, there is a variety of methods using different assumptions on estimating elasticities and productivities relatedly, but all of these methods assume that firms are optimizing in one way or another. This is an assumption that I don't make in the pre-period, given what the institutional constraints are. So the alternative approach I'm taking is that I'm going to use the post-periods data for estimation. So for a given industry, I'm going to assume that these alpha output elasticities for the 1990s are the same as they were in the 1980s. What this assumption really entails is that the physical process in which a given amount of labor and a given amount of capital conditional on firm productivity is combined is not changing between the 1980s and the 1990s. I have some indirect evidence which does not contradict this assumption, but also the results are not sensitive to this assumption. Okay, so here are the main results. So taking the fall in total GDP between 87 and 93 to be minus 100%, the different lines tells you out of this minus 100% for what percent is the different factors responsible. So the takeaway from this table is two. There are two components which are disproportionately larger relative to the rest in both the fall and the recovery. 93% of the decline in GDP between these two time periods is accounted for by a decline in labor. Similarly, aggregate productivity changing also pulls GDP down, but its contribution is much smaller relative to labor's contribution. And just to remind you, one of the main papers I mentioned in the introduction had predictions for how productivity would respond to the liberalization. And according to that paper, at least the paper was consistent with this being the most important factor in accounting for the decline. And similarly, the other paper had implications for this being the most important. And while they are pulling GDP down, the largest component is clearly the decline in labor. And the major takeaway from the recovery part is that over 100% is accounted for by an improvement in aggregate productivity. If you go and separate the A part further, you can see that really the allocative efficiency improvements are what's driving the recovery as opposed to the mean firm's productivity changing. So moving on to why did labor decline to such a large extent between the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s, let me move on to the next part. So I look at a very simple static first order condition of the firm. Is it the case that the marginal revenue product of labor at the firm year level is equal or close to the wage at the firm year level? The average wage at the firm year level I observe, and the left-hand side I'm able to construct using the objects I estimated before or that I observe in the data. What I see is that many firms in the pre-period have a negative wedge, meaning the marginal revenue product of labor is consistently lower relative to the average wage they are paying. I'm going to label firms which have this characteristic in all years in the pre-period to be overemployer firms. This is a characteristic that a firm is going to carry with it during the 1990s. So this is just a firm-specific characteristics. I call someone an overemployer if during the 1980s they were overemployers. So now I'd like to understand how these overemployer firms behave in terms of their employment decisions prior to and post the 1990 reform. So in order to do that, I run this regression where the left-hand side is log labor at the firm year level. The right-hand side has a time fixed effect, has a firm fixed effect, and has, importantly, this dummy of whether a firm is an overemployer or not. The coefficients of interest here are these beta t's, and I plot them here for you. What we can see is that prior to 1990, these overemployer firms do not behave differently relative to the rest of the firms, but after the fall of communism, they see their employment decline by an additional 40% relative to the rest of the firms. And you can restrict this sample to firms which survived until the end of the 2000s, and you see a 35% number. So this is not just due to exiters. Now you can further try to understand, is there any particular types of workers which are responsible for this differential decline of employment of overemployers versus non-overemployers by replacing the left-hand side variable by particular types of workers as opposed to just aggregate employment. So when I do that and run the regressions, I find that it is typically the lower educated, the more vulnerable, and the lower skilled workers which are responsible for this differential decline in employment of overemployers versus not in this period. So now you might also ask the question of how is this possible that there were all these firms which are making suboptimal employment decisions for an extended amount of time? Shouldn't this show up at some point in their performance results, in their profits, etc.? And in fact, I find that in the pre-period, there were many loss-making firms. The losses are financed by the state. these loss-making firms did not seem to shut down. And you can see that there is a structural relationship change after the 1990 relative to before when it comes to exiting and being a loss maker firm. So industry fixed effect, year fixed effect, loss maker status in a given year for a given firm, and the probability of exit on the left-hand side. You can see why there is a positive and significant relationship prior to 1990 between being a loss maker and exiting. The relationship becomes much stronger in the post period. So I wanted to make this point that the state exactly knew that there were these loss-making firms and that they might have been overemploying. However, they did not let them close down or decrease their employment, exactly realizing that this would cause local unemployment problems. I don't have time to read the exact quote, but there is a secret document in the archives which exactly points out this problem. Right, so let me move on very quickly since I have very little time left to the last part of the paper, which aims at understanding why these aggregate productivity gains materialize, or how rather they materialize. So as I earlier showed you, the majority of this 108% is really coming from improvements in both capital and labor allocation efficiency. So what I'm going to do in order to answer this question is I'm going to employ a quasi-random experiment related to the privatization of the banking sector. In the pre-periods, there was one way for a firm to get access to loans, and this was through the branch network of the Central Bank of Hungary. And in the 1990s, the four large state-owned banks, which got created using this original branch network, got privatized in a staggered way in different years. So I'm going to exploit exactly this staggered nature of banking privatization and the fact that these large state-owned banks had very different, meaning in very different subregions of the country, branch network. And just to make the point that when a bank got privatized, its entire branch network across the country got privatized. So there was no cherry picking that I only privatized this in the best performing subregion of the country. The regression I'm interested in running here is has an allocative efficiency of capital in the subregion year level, and I'm interested in understanding conditional and subregion fixed effects, year fixed effects, number of branches in the subregion and year pair. When the bank gets privatized in this subregion, do we see any improvement in the allocative efficiency of capital? I'm only going to use the privatized branches in subregions where the bank branch had been there in the previous 50 years, to avoid any type of endogeneity coming from the privatized banks going into areas which anyway would have been expected to grow and see improvements in capital allocation efficiency. And as you can see, I find a significant and positive coefficient, meaning that that the privatization experiment seems to be correlated with the allocation efficiency gains of capital. Very quick conclusion, since I'm almost out of time. So what I've shown you is through Hungarian microdata, this surprising output pattern of post-communist countries can be accounted for by an initial large fall in labor's contribution to GDP and by subsequent large gains in allocative efficiency. The pre-periods overemploying firms saw their employment decline by an additional 40% relative to the non-overemployers and their own means after the liberalization, but they did not behave differently prior to the liberalization. And there are particular subgroups of workers which are responsible for this differential decline. And these are typically the low-skilled and the low-educated workers. And this is consistent with the world in which the firm sector was providing a social safety net the government was providing the social safety net to the workers via the firm sector, and in particular via their distorted employment decisions. And finally, I've shown you some brief evidence which is consistent with the idea that the capital reallocation gains at the sub-region level are facilitated by the liberalization of markets. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is clearly an immense amount of work from the look of it, and then very interesting. Who would like to open a discussion? Perhaps as a first one, I seem to recall that in the, if you're talking about allocative efficiency with productivity and inputs, so that improved a lot in the recovery period, but it also, if I remember, it also fell quite a lot in the first period.
Yeah.
How do we understand that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So what ended up happening is that between the end of the 80s and the early 1990s, there was a large amount of small and productive firms entering. However, initially they continued to be small. And so relative to the end of the 1980s, allocative efficiency actually worsened.
Okay. And perhaps also, so this gives us a much richer view of what happened in this period than, for instance, some of the earlier firm level work done by out of the OECD and by people like Bartelsman, who also reported improving allocative efficiency, as you mentioned it as you measure it in the 1990s. Now, one feature of this seems to, well, my reading of some of the other work on this seems to be that that this improvement in allocative efficiency was very much related to this communist transition, where you indeed had these overemployer firms and substantially distorted labor markets. While you don't see as much of a clear pattern in this allocative efficiency measure across countries with poorer countries having worse resource allocation. So that was my understanding of this. But do you have a sense of how this compares to that? Whether this is sort of the story of the communist transition or a broader story?
I think that in many countries which are not necessarily communists, there is a large role of the state, obviously not comparable to communist countries, but think about China today, semi-communist, having a large role of the state sector. India used to have a very large role of the state sector. And I was just recently looking at reports how large the role of state banking still is in a very, very large share of countries today. So even related to that, I think this links very nicely to today low-income countries, where state banks tends to be more important than in high-income countries today.
Okay, thank you. Joe, and then Louise.
In some ways, this reminds me of Jim Schmidt's paper on iron ore, and where they had overemployment because of the union. It's interesting because if it was just like excess employment, so labor just sitting around doing nothing, and then you get rid of that labor, you wouldn't see much of a fall in output. But you're seeing both the fall in output and the fall in labor. And it leads me to think that maybe it's something about like how we think of things being continuous might be an issue, which is somehow the excess labor might change the way labor is organized in such an inefficient manner that you can't easily correct it, and then the firm just goes out of business. So I was curious whether there's anything to that type of a story, and how much of firm entry and exit is going to be explaining this employment.
No, that's a great question. So I think the results, which I didn't show you, but they're here. So if you look at these regressions on the subset of firms which are a long-term survival sample, you can see a similar pattern for them. Other than that, if you look at exiters, yes, overemployers are overrepresented among the firms that exit in the early 1990s. Whether this has to do with how they are organized or simply the fact that given the constraints of the market economy, they weren't able to reorganize or they weren't able to, I guess, reorganize, but I'm not sure if it's from a labor perspective reorganize or management perspective or some other perspective reorganize quick enough to be able to be competitive in the market economy environment. I don't know the answer to that, but it's a very good question.
All
Did
right.
that answer the question, sort of?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, so we have two more questions before we have another break. So from Luis in the chat, whether there's a change in trend following the recovery.
A change in trend in what?
Well, I would.
Oh, in GDP.
Yeah, maybe Luis. Yeah, so maybe whether
GDP. Yeah. There is a little increase in trend, but not a very large one. And if you try to look a little bit in the longer run, unfortunately, you run into the problem that there is the Great Recession, which again changes things and the trend as well.
Okay. Alberto?
Hi, I was wondering if you also have a bit of information on the wage bill at the firm level or some type of aggregation, because I noticed that you're using aggregate TFP. But say if you had that kind of information, you could do a little bit of a growth accounting exercise like Jorgensen does, and try to pick apart those terms to see how much of that is associated to capital and how much of that to labor. So I think that would be interesting.
So I'm actually using firm level TFP everywhere. So I'm not sure I understood the question. Maybe you were asking whether whether I'm doing any growth accounting like exercise as opposed to using firm level decompositions.
Say, when you look at how Jorgensen does his growth accounting exercises, he tries to extend, say, the quality of labor and quality of capital, and he does that by using those like the wage bill and the remaining associated to capital. So I think that would be a little bit interesting to try to just separate that total TFP term.
Yeah, no, I do actually do that. So in an extension, which it's in one of these, unfortunately don't know right now which of the clickers, but I do try to look at the quality of labor by taking account their wage as well. So I do that in a robustness checks, which is in the labor, in the paper, and the results are very similar.
All right. So Krisztina, let me thank you again for a very nice presentation.